Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time today to be here for our November webinar, Fostering Inclusive and Body Positive Culture for Students and Staff in Higher Education with Kate Walford. My name is Cherise Bunn, and I am the Director of Education for Oregon Women in Higher Education. So I've been leading the webinars this year and will continue for the first part of next year. So thank you so much for giving us some of your time. I wanted to share with you some of the opportunities we have with OE education. So one thing is actually to propose or to listen to a webinar. We really appreciate you participating with us today, and we look forward to future participation. If you have content or a webinar idea or a presentation you've shared that you think the OE community could benefit from, I would encourage you to propose the webinar. And it goes through a vetting process, and we will get back to you about that and help you adapt it for the OE audience. So please be encouraged to do that. I would also encourage you to write for OE. So we have an OE blog, and if you haven't written for it or read it before, I encourage you to do it. There's some amazing content on there. In fact, today I even sent something on negotiations to a colleague who's getting ready for her next step. So it's a really, really awesome tool. Also, we have the OE book club, which this year we read as a group, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Difficult Women. Next year we will have some more reads that we read together, so I just encourage you to get involved in that way. And then we have some other upcoming webinars. So in December we have Gender 101 with Brianna Stansberry. And then we have our first one for 2019. On January 11th, we're going to have OE presentation tips, and this will help with getting ready for the OE conference, and then also if you're doing any other sort of presentation. So that should be pretty cool. Lastly, I wanted to give a plug for the 2019 OE conference in Lincoln City, Oregon. It is February 1st and 2nd. The conference program is up and line. The registration is still open, so please consider joining us for the conference. It's a great way to connect and feel empowered. So with that, I'm actually going to give it over to Kate, who is our presenter today. Kate, take it away.
Hi there. Let me share my screen really fast with you all. Okay, hi. So thank you so much. Yeah?
You still need to share.
Oh, it's shared. Is that shared now? Are we good?
Yes, you're sharing.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're sharing the presentation slides.
Did that work?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thanks for your patience. Sorry about that. Awesome. So thank you so much, Cherise, for the introduction and more information about awesome stuff that OE is doing. My name is Kate Walford. I currently live in Portland, and as of recently, just a couple months ago, I work at Reed College as the student work coordinator here. So thanks so much for joining me for this webinar, which is called Fostering Inclusive and Body Positive Culture for Students and Staff in Higher Education. So I wanted to, first of all, before we get started, give a little bit of my background and why I'm interested in talking about this subject, which is really near and dear to my heart. So this is a picture of me here doing non-work related things, but definitely body related things. I play roller derby in Portland. So I have personal experiences with negative body image and an eating disorder from middle school through college, which is really what originally got me interested in this subject. To tie it into the college setting, I attempted and sought out resources and somewhat experienced treatment and recovery while I was in college. So I attempted to navigate those systems in a college setting personally. I also, throughout college and after my undergrad, I wrote on the subject. I contributed articles talking about body image and my experiences with that on Adios Barbary and Everyday Feminism. And then finally, I've also done research throughout grad school on body image and resources on college campuses, and have taught seminars to college students about body image, sort of with a critical theory lens. So that's my background and interest in tying body image into higher education. Okay, so this is just an overview of what we're going to talk about today, sort of a roadmap of this webinar. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over some basics. So I'm going to give some language and definitions surrounding body image and disordered eating, and what we really mean when we say that. And then I'm going to give some statistics around body image and disordered eating, specifically on college campuses today. So kind of give a picture of what it looks like out there for college students. And then I'm going to talk about what resources colleges often have, which is something I've done research on in grad school. And then I'm going to move into talking about why this is important to talk about in a college setting. I know that a lot of you probably don't work directly in like student health programming or something that's really directly tied into this on a college campus. So I'm going to talk about why it's important to know about and think about regardless of what role you're in your institution. And also challenge us to think outside of just our role in higher education, but also how this might impact other spaces that we occupy in our lives. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about actual strategies for creating a more inclusive, positive culture on campus regarding bodies and eating. I'm going to talk more about what some institutions have done, so what some of the resources out there are currently. And I'm also going to discuss gaps in those and ways that anyone, again, even if you're not directly in, say, health promotion, can foster an inclusive and positive culture, just as someone who interacts with students and other staff on a daily basis. Oh, and with regard to questions, if you have questions, I'm mostly going to be saving them for the end, but if there's a question that's really important or relevant for what we're talking about, if you type it in the box, Charisse will be monitoring those. Okay. So a couple of guidelines before we get started. This can be a difficult subject to talk about and hear about for some of us. It affects a lot of people. So I have some guidelines that I use when I have facilitated learning or discussions around body image and disordered eating. So I want everyone to know that I am not going to talk about really specific like eating disorder habits or symptoms or weight or anything like that during this webinar, but I am going to define eating disorders and talk about what they are. And that alone can be difficult for some people, so please take care of yourself and do what you need to do. This webinar isn't going to be super interactive until the end for questions, but if you are going to post a question or a thought, I ask that everyone follow these guidelines of just not discussing specific like eating disorder symptoms, habits, weight, etc., and talking more in generalities if we can. And then lastly, if you're looking for resources for yourself or someone else, or you feel you need something to reach out to during or because of this webinar, I would highly recommend the National Eating Disorders Association website, NEDA for short. That is right on here. There's a link in the PowerPoint, and there's also a link in the resources document that Charisse shared out via the chat. And they have a great hotline you can call. They even have a chat hotline. They have screening tools, community around these issues. So I would definitely use that as a resource if you feel yourself or someone else needing it. Okay. So the first definition I'm going to talk about is body image, which is what this webinar is all about. There are lots of different definitions of this out there. This one is from NEDA. And they define it as body image is defined as one's thoughts, perceptions, and attitudes about their physical appearance. How do you see yourself and feel about your body, height, shape, and weight when you look in the mirror? This also involves what you believe about your own appearance, including your memories about that, assumptions, and generalizations. Additionally, how you feel about your body, including your height, shape, and weight. And also how you sense and control your body as you move. So how you physically experience or feel in your body. So that's a really broad definition. Again, there are many different definitions of this. I really like this one because it it not only includes how you think you look or your feelings about your body, but actually how you experience your body on a daily basis as you move through your life, which I think is really important. Okay. So getting a little bit more into body image, I'm going to talk about negative body image next. So negative body image, this definition is also from NIDA, or these bullet points are, can involve a distorted perception of one's shape, so having a distorted view of what one actually looks like. It can also not involve that. It just really depends on the person. But regardless of whether or not the perception of one's self and body is distorted, this involves feelings of shame, anxiety, and self-consciousness about the body specifically. Often, negative body image has to do with comparison to others' bodies, whether it's people around you that you actually know, or maybe images of bodies in the media. And leading to a feeling that one's body is not as good as other bodies, or that one's body is in some way flawed. So that's negative body image. Again, it's really broad, and the effects of it are not great. They include depression, isolation from others, especially like really social isolation, low self-esteem, and disordered eating, which we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. And I think it's important to mention that having negative body image or feeling bad about one's body has been shown to not be a motivator for healthy behaviors. So feeling bad about oneself and how oneself looks is not motivating for healthy exercise or healthy eating. It's actually the opposite. The better that one feels about their body and the more comfortable one feels in their body, the more likely they are to actually take care of it. So before I move on, I just want to talk briefly about how prevalent this is. I'll get into statistics more in a minute, but this is extremely prevalent. Practically, and studies have shown that practically everyone who identifies as female in the United States has dealt with negative body image at one time or another. So it's really common, especially for women and for non-binary or transgender individuals. I will say that most research around body image has been done on cisgender women, and we'll talk a little bit more about issues of diversity later. But when these studies do say women, they're generally referring to that, especially older ones. So on the flip side, positive body image. What is that? I'm also going to use a definition from NIDA. They say that positive body image is a clear, true perception of your shape, seeing the various parts of your body as they really are. Body positivity, or also called body satisfaction, involves feeling comfortable and confident in your body, accepting your natural body shape and size, and recognizing that physical appearance says very little about one's character and value as a person. So there's also a lot in there. I like this definition because it talks about having a real perception of one's body and accepting what one's body really looks like and feeling good about that. But it also involves realizing that that's not really the most important part of who you are. And I think that's something that positive body image sometimes leaves out. And that's a really essential piece for me and for this webinar about body positivity, is that it's not this thing where you have to feel like you love your body and it's so amazing and you think about how great it is all the time. It's something where you feel good about it, but you also don't feel the need to think about it too much. It's just not the most important thing about you. So now that we have that definition, I also want to problematize this idea a little bit. The idea that one should be positive about your body, or especially the slogan, quote, love your body, can be pretty problematic. In some ways, loving your body, especially as someone who's female, can be yet another societal expectation, especially of women. And I've felt this in recovery. Some people really, really wanted me to do a lot of work so that I could say I really loved my body. And I was fine just kind of not caring what it looked like, kind of valuing other things about myself over that. I didn't feel the need to love it. And I think that asking people to really do all that work and get to that place where they really love it, that can be a lot, and it can also just be okay to be all right with one's body. Another reason why this can be problematic is it can feel really overwhelming or unattainable for people who are in recovery from an eating disorder, as well as for trans and non-binary individuals who might be experiencing some body dysmorphia, which is a really distorted vision of one's body, or maybe planning or going through with gender confirmation surgery or taking hormones, which will change their bodies. So it can really exclude that population when we ask people to love their body. And finally, like I said earlier, the idea of loving your body, I think, still really focuses on the body sometimes rather than all the other great things about an individual. Okay. So next I am going to talk about disordered eating, and this is really prevalent to college students and anyone working on college campuses. So there are a lot of different definitions of disordered eating, but I have chosen this one from Eating Disorders Victoria, which is an Australian organization. Disordered eating refers to a wide range of abnormal eating behaviors, many of which are shared with diagnosed eating disorders. The main thing differentiating disordered eating from an eating disorder is the level of severity and frequency of behaviors. So basically, disordered eating is, like they say, abnormal eating behaviors, but it's generally not as severe as a full-blown diagnosable eating disorder, which we're going to talk about next. So effects of any type of disordered eating include fatigue, malnutrition, poor concentration, social isolation, anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, and other physical health consequences depending on the type of behavior. So as those working in higher education, I'm sure you can see that these are things that we really, really wouldn't want college students to experience when we're looking at things like student success and retention. Experiencing disordered eating really, really dampens quality of life. And it's also incredibly important to recognize how detrimental disordered eating can be, even if the person suffering from it doesn't meet the threshold for an actual eating disorder. So I'm not going to go into detail about this, but the threshold for being diagnosed with a full-blown eating disorder can be actually really, really high. So someone can be doing really extreme harm to their body through disordered eating, but they might not actually get a diagnosis of an eating disorder. And that's one reason why it's just really important to recognize all forms of disordered eating as really troubling and really difficult for the person experiencing them. So now I'm going to do a final definition here, which is an actual eating disorder. This is a definition from the American Psychiatric Association. Eating disorders are illnesses in which the people experience severe disturbances in their eating behaviors and related thoughts and emotions. People with eating disorders typically become preoccupied with food and their body weight. The reason I chose this definition is that it highlights that eating disorders and also disordered eating in general is not only about physical behaviors and symptoms and harm to the physical body. It's also really important to recognize the mental aspect of the really extreme preoccupation with food and body and weight that can kind of like take over someone's entire brain and make it really difficult to concentrate on anything else in their life. So on the right here, there are some types of eating disorders that I'm going to go through really quickly. There are a lot more types than this, but these are the most common ones and probably the most relevant to college age, traditional college age students. Anorexia is the first one. You've probably heard of that one, which is restricting food intake, so not eating enough, essentially starving the body. Bulimia, which is binging and purging, eating large amounts of food and generally vomiting them. Binge eating disorder, which is similar to bulimia, but it doesn't include purging. It's just eating really large amounts of food and feeling out of control in that. Orthorexia is a rather new one, and it is an extreme concern about food purity. So it's believed to be somewhat spurred by a lot of the new diet culture that surrounds purity of food and clean eating. And when that gets taken to an extreme, it can be diagnosed as orthorexia. And the last two, OSFED and USFED, are newer disorders, which are often used to diagnose people who have really severe disordered eating, but it still doesn't quite meet a threshold for one of the above eating disorders. Like I said before, they're really specific in terms of what qualifies as a diagnosis for them. So there are a lot of people experiencing eating disorders who might be diagnosed with OSFED or USFED just because their symptoms don't fit really specifically into one of the above eating disorders. So how are body image and eating disorders connected? Sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. Body image, negative body image can absolutely exist without any disordered eating. That happens all the time. But studies have shown that the biggest risk factor for developing an eating disorder is negative body image. It's the biggest sort of precursor to that. In general, I mentioned this before, but feeling bad about your body doesn't lead to healthier eating or exercise habits. It makes you feel worse. So having poor body image can really contribute to unhealthy eating habits or dieting habits that then slide into disordered eating. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the prevalence of this. I tried to pull statistics that are most relevant to working with college students. A lot of these statistics focus on women who are generally the largest group experiencing these issues, but there are issues with all of these statistics in terms of inclusivity regarding individuals who aren't cisgender, as well as people of color, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that more on the next slide. So just know that a lot of the research out there right now is often really skewed towards white women when we're looking at these statistics, and that's getting a little bit better. So the first statistic is in a 2013 study, 74% of women said that concerns about weight and shape interfere with their happiness. And what that says to me is it really echoes the sentiment that even negative body image without any disordered eating can be really detrimental for one's quality of life. The next statistic is 91% of college women surveyed reported having tried to control weight through dieting. So that essentially means that most women in college that you might be working with have probably tried to control their weight through dieting at some point. 25% of college students attempt to control their weight using behaviors associated with bulimia. Again, that's binging and purging, and that eating disorder is really, really, really harmful on the body and has a lot of negative health effects. So that's a really high number of college students who are engaging in those behaviors. Lastly, 35% of dieters progress to disordered eating. And then of those, 20 to 25% of those progress to partial or full syndrome eating disorders. So that statistic really highlights the danger of dieting, and especially for college students, if 91% of college women are engaging in dieting and then 35% of those dieters progress to disordered eating, that's a really large chunk of the female college student population that are dealing with these issues. Before we move on, I want to say that the prevalence of these issues, body image and disordered eating, does vary slightly across racial, ethnic, gender, and sexuality groups, but those are absolutely not predictors of body image or disordered eating. Anyone from any background in any of those groups is at risk for these things, and I'm going to talk a little bit more on the next slide. Okay, oops. So I want to talk about diversity and equity in research and prevention and things that are happening on college campuses in regards to body image and disordered eating. So Negative body image and disordered eating and all of the negative effects that I've talked about are mostly experienced by members of marginalized gender groups. So women and non-binary folks, trans folks, as well as gay men. There's really only one exception or one group that seems to be actually protected from these issues, and that's straight cisgender males in general don't experience these issues at nearly the rate of all other groups. So popular culture and even research, because it has been done on primarily white women in the past, kind of tells us that these issues are faced by upper class white women, that eating disorders are an issue of wealthier white cisgender women. In reality, newer studies are showing us that that's absolutely not the case. The prevalence of these issues is widespread across every group. And although really prevalent, these issues are likely to go unnoticed and underdiagnosed in marginalized populations. So often because we think, or a doctor thinks that, oh, those kind of people don't get eating disorders. Kind of our internal biases come out. On the NIDA website, there's a study in which they gave doctors patient profiles that had eating disorder symptoms, and they also had the race of the patient and asked them what they would do with that patient, and they were significantly less likely to diagnose a Black woman with an eating disorder than they were a white woman, even with the same symptoms. So there's a lot of bias that's going into sort of perpetuating the story that these issues don't happen in marginalized or minority populations. A couple of myths that have circulated in body image about these issues are that certain types of women don't face these issues, and that's really harmful, as I mentioned above, for being undernoticed and underdiagnosed. One of them was it was thought that lesbian women were kind of protected from body image issues because they weren't subject to the male gaze of male partners. New studies have shown that this is totally untrue. We still live in a very patriarchal society where everyone is subject to male standards of beauty, just being in this world. And lesbian women are just as likely, if not more, to have these issues in their lives as women who identify as straight. Another one of these that came up is that for Black women, it often goes underdiagnosed because earlier research showed that there might be a cultural difference that didn't value being thin as much in the Black community. However, they're seeing higher and higher rates of Black women experiencing eating disorders. And there was recently a really interesting study, interesting and disheartening study that showed that Black women in college were surveyed, and the more they experienced internalized racism, the more body image issues they faced. So the racism that they experienced in their everyday lives contributed to negative body image and feeling bad about themselves. And I think it's really important to remember that everyone, regardless of background, is subject to a standard of beauty in our society that really revolves around being thin, and it also revolves around white skin. So lastly, before I move on, I'll mention that a lot of the programming that happens on college campuses and programming in general for preventing body image issues and eating disorders has been designed for and studied using primarily white women. So we don't necessarily know how effective these efforts are for women, for people who aren't white women, essentially. Okay, so now I'm going to move into talking about why this is important in higher education, and why it might be important even if you're not distinctly working on this issue in your role in higher ed. So how does this intersect with your work wherever you are? This is a community issue and one that mostly affects women and non-binary folks. The median age of onset for full-blown eating disorders is 18 to 21. So that is the age of a traditional college student. So if someone's going to suffer from an eating disorder, it's extremely likely that they're going to begin that eating disorder while they're in college. Next, there are a lot of equity issues that are surround body image and disordered eating, and that's something that higher ed, I think, can really work on. people of color and LGBTQ individuals are left out of the narrative of body image issues a lot. And we have the chance in higher ed to make awareness and programming a lot more inclusive. Next, we're role models. So anyone who's working with students on a daily basis is an adult role model in their life. It has been shown through numerous studies that body image is really highly affected by relationships, so by parents or peers. And that's where we get a lot of our ideas about bodies. So especially for traditional age students, they may have just left home where they had a really specific idea about bodies and body image. And now if we're in their lives, we're role models for them of healthy adult lives. And we can be role models of them for positive body image or body neutral environments. So we have that opportunity. I also want to mention that I think college is a time when students are experiencing a lot of open-mindedness and paradigm changes. So they're often being challenged in their courses to think about things in a really different way and maybe change their point of view. And so I think that it can be a good window to talk to students about body image and about beauty standards, and maybe allow for some changes to their paradigm around that. Institutions can definitely negatively impact students' body image and disordered eating habits. They can make choices that really aren't healthy for students. One example I have, which there's a link on the resource sheet, is that there was a school a couple of years ago that made all of their freshman students wear a fitness tracker, which they also had to purchase themselves, and they had to get a certain amount of exercise as part of their grade. As part of an actual graded course. And they had to get 10,000 steps a day for that, which I've heard in other places is a good metric of how much exercise one should get. But regulating it to that extent, especially for college students who might not be able to prioritize that all the time, some days they just might not be able to do that. Really regulating that can really contribute to compulsive exercise or promoting dieting and such. And I think the main reason why we should all care about this and work towards creating a better environment is that we care about student success, both academic and personal. We've talked about some of the really awful symptoms of disordered eating and even just negative body image. Eating disorders are truly disabling. Some eating disorders score really high on a disability scale. And that means that the person experiencing them is really truly impaired from most aspects of their daily life, and most certainly from academic success. So I think that's important to bring up in terms of why we care about this in higher education specifically. So this slide talks a bit about what resources institutions actually have. What are we doing? And some of this is a part of research that I did in grad school on what colleges in Oregon and Washington specifically generally have for students surrounding this. Some of this information also comes from a study that NEDA did where they surveyed nationally what sort of resources are available on campuses, which there's also a link to. So some institutions have curriculum surrounding this in academic classrooms, which is a great way to spur change, I think. There's a link on your sheet to a fat studies course at Southern Oregon University, which I think is really interesting. Some institutions have prevention programming. So this is usually run through a health center or through peer health educators. Most of the time, this is really just informational, so maybe presentations or pamphlets to students or mentions of eating disorders in an online health module to let them know where they can find resources and what maybe some symptoms of eating disorders are. There are some actual developed research, more like curriculum-based programs for combating negative body image and disordered eating on campuses out there. Two that I've seen a lot are Health at Every Size and the Body Project. And if you want to learn more about those, they're really well-developed curriculums, and there are links to them on your resource sheet as well. Both of those have been incorporated on campuses into student groups, full campus initiatives, and actually 4-credit classes on campuses that students have taken. Some colleges also have turned them or other things into online body image programs for students. But it's important to mention that most of these programs are opt-in, so it's only generally only for students who want to go through like a body image or eating disorder prevention program. Most colleges have some sort of treatment. Four-year colleges usually do at health and counseling centers, which can usually work with students on like lower level issues such as body image issues or disordered eating. But if a student has a full eating disorder, those are generally referred off-site to a treatment center. And then support and community. Some colleges have support groups for students who are dealing with these issues. I think that to me, those have seemed rarer. They require a really skilled facilitator because it's difficult to have productive group conversations about eating disorder symptoms. And lastly, some places have student groups that are dedicated to talking about these issues on campus and changing campus culture. One example that I've found and was a little bit involved in is at Portland State University. They have a body politics action team, which is great. And they have events and bring in speakers and host activities surrounding body politics, which is really, really great. So what's missing in general from these things we have on college campuses? Actually, before I dive into this slide, I forgot to mention that according to that national survey, over a third of students who were surveyed said that their school didn't offer any resources at all regarding body image and eating disorders. And that may be because their school actually didn't, or it may be because their school didn't advertise it well enough, and so they had no idea they were there. So even for schools that have some programming, there's a lot of work to be done. First of all, I think training for faculty and staff is really important, and this can even be self-training. I have some resources for that here. Those working with students really need to understand the warning signs of not just a full-blown eating disorder, but of any body image or eating issues. As we talked about before, dieting can easily slide into a full-blown eating disorder, and we need to be recognizing those things potentially before they're really serious. A lot of people still think that you can tell if someone has an eating disorder just by looking at whether or not they're really thin, which is not the case at all. Any body type can experience any type of disordered eating. So one thing that I would say for everyone watching this webinar is a really great resource for you to kind of self-train on this is the link to NEDA that I provided for warning signs and symptoms. It's a really good, it kind of covers all the bases, and it'll tell you kind of what to look for if you're concerned about this in students and how to have a conversation with them. I think that campuses also need to do a better job of including discussions about disordered eating in mental health trainings. I've been in a lot of mental health trainings where this isn't really mentioned. So if you're a part of planning trainings where mental health is discussed, I would really encourage you to include disordered eating and include the signs and symptoms of that. Another important thing is that a lot of staff and faculty don't necessarily know where to refer students when they find out that this is an issue. Is it the health center? Is it the counseling center? Should you send them to a crisis line or the NEDA website? Should they be going to a hospital? It can be really unclear. So that's another thing that all of us can do is try to clarify for ourselves and others in our office where the resources are for this and what we would do if we had a student experiencing these issues. Secondly, clear and accessible resources for students are really, really important. Eating disorders are extremely shame-based. I personally, when I was in college and suffering, I only sought out resources really privately through like looking at websites or pamphlets. It's really, really likely that a student will not open up about an eating disorder. That's very common. But they may look for information on their own, such as in a pamphlet or on a health and counseling center website. So it's really important that these resources, if they exist, are really explicit and not just word of mouth. If the counseling center can talk to students about disordered eating and help them with it, that needs to be on their webpage, not just something the students have to guess because they most likely won't ask somebody about it. So what can we do? Several things. Like I said before, we know from research that body image is highly influenced by peers and role models, parents and close friends in particular. So we can be a positive influence not only on students, but also on others in our office. Even if you don't work directly in health programming, you can make a really big difference by making sure that your language and actions, or maybe the language or of your office on campus, create an inclusive and body positive environment. I like to think small here and start thinking with actually about me, my person, being a small body positive environment that anyone who's talking to me will experience body positivity with me. And then expanding outwards from there, maybe I think about my office or my department or my home or a group of my friends or my coworkers, and how can I create a space around myself that is inclusive in their language and careful with their language to be body positive. And that's what we're going to talk about next. And all these ideas are for everywhere. I think it's really important to think about them in any space you occupy or any community you're a part of. They're really not specific necessarily to higher ed. So changing your language is, I think, one of the most important parts of being a body positive environment yourself. And I want to mention microaggressions when we talk about this. So a microaggression, here's a definition of it, if you maybe haven't heard of these before. It is a statement, action, or incident regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group. Often a microaggression will assume something about someone because of an identity they have, or maybe put value on something without realizing it, and therefore devalue something else. We might have heard these talked about for race or gender or ability, but they apply to size as well. So there's some examples on the screen. I'm not going to read all of them, but you'll notice that the issues that exist within these statements are that they put value on weight loss or thinness generally. They seem to be saying, maybe indirectly, that losing weight is good or gaining weight is inherently not good or unhealthy. So these are some really common examples up here. Another one I'd like to point out at the bottom is gendered comments can really affect body image too, even if we wouldn't think of those as microaggressions necessarily. Saying something like, you have girl hips, or you've got the body of a teenage boy, especially if it's someone whose gender you don't know very well. This assumes gender, and it also makes the assumption that one's gender predicts their body shape or type, which is really not true and can be really exclusive for non-binary and transgender individuals. So just something to think about. So more about creating a culture with language to avoid these sort of microaggressions or avoid making people feel badly about their bodies. My guidance is to avoid making value judgments about size, weight, shape, food, or eating. So erase sort of the value of things within that. One size isn't better than another, one weight isn't better than another, one shape, one food, or how one eats. This might seem basic and it might seem silly, but one way that I've dealt with this is actually to just pretty much avoid talking about any of those things. If I'm worried about whether or not I'm going to be inclusive or whether or not I'm going to make someone feel bad about their body or their eating, I just don't talk about it. That's what I've been doing. So if you avoid talking about weight, your own or others' dieting or calories, you kind of avoid bringing any of this up. Another thing that I want to say is it can be really helpful to redirect the conversation away from these topics if someone else brings them up. These can be difficult things to challenge, but if someone starts talking about their weight or dieting or calories, you can promote a more body positive culture by directing the conversation away from those things. And really, the more we talk about these things, the more we value them. If we spend all of our time with our friends talking about these things, it says to them that we really value this about ourselves and about them. And if we talk less about them, we value them less in our lives, which I think is great. Okay, so other things you can do: avoid assumptions and advocate for inclusivity. When you're working with individual students who might be having these issues, validate the effects of negative body image and disordered eating. That's really important. Even if the student doesn't have a full-blown eating disorder, validate how difficult these things are. And don't assume that a student won't be dealing with these issues because of family background, national origin, race, gender, or sexuality. Make sure that resources and marketing are inclusive. If you're in charge of these resources on campus, make sure they really are. Make sure that these programs or resources are not designed only for cisgender white females. Is the curriculum you're using or you've made centered around white students? Is it centered around female students? Change language and activities within programming if it is. Open it up to talking about how culture influences body image. Provide articles and speakers and resources from diverse perspectives. I think getting help from others on campus who have expertise within these groups or a part of these groups can be really helpful if you aren't. Also with advertising, if you have these programs, don't create marketing materials with thin white women. That might seem really obvious, but I have seen so many body image group things advertised with a bunch of thin white women on the cover, and that's just really not inclusive. Questioning problematic language and programs. So there are plenty of ways in which campuses can have problematic language and programming out there to students, including dieting programs or promotion of these, programs that focus on counting calories or weight loss, programs that are not inclusive beyond white women, and exercise requirements, as we talked about before. So if you're seeing those on your campus, I think it's a really great chance to speak up and use your voice to talk to the people who are in charge of those, even if it's not within your department, about what you see that might be going on there. So I think things you can do is you can provide critical feedback. See if there are other groups who might be an ally for you that also might want to interrogate these issues or advocate for change with you. Something to remember is that a lot of people are really unaware of sizeism, even if they're really aware of other isms. When it comes up, a lot of people really haven't heard of it. So maybe assume best intentions when you go into the conversation. And also bring more inclusive and body positive resources to their attention if you're asking for a change. There's a lot of books and articles and resources that you can use if you need to prove that something is not healthy for students. A lot of those I have listed on your sheet and at the end of the webinar. Another thing we can do is talk about sizeism. If you're going to be facilitating or be a part of discussions about social justice or equity or inclusion, bring this up. It's really often left out, just like eating disorders are often left out of mental health discussions. Creating some dissonance on the subject is really helpful. Like I said, a lot of people are unaware of sizeism, and a lot of people are really, really ingrained in their ideas about weight and bodies. It's a really difficult thing to change how you feel about and how you think about. So if you're going to talk about it, providing resources, a lot of which I have at the end of this webinar, that kind of critique the thin ideal and critique the idea of thinness being better or weight loss being essential, can be really helpful if you're going to have a conversation about this or bring this up as part of a bigger conversation. And on that note, I would say really be ready for pushback. Like I said, the unawareness, the lack of awareness around sizeism is really prevalent. And these ideas are so ingrained that don't expect these new ideas to be taken right away. It can take a long time for these to, for minds to change about this stuff. So here are there's some links up here, and they're also on your sheet, on your resource sheet, that I think are really great resources for curriculum, even small curriculum, like even if you're just going to have a discussion. There's a few resources there. And those two books at the bottom are fantastic resources for just like starting a conversation around why we have certain ideals about our bodies and why that's problematic. So lastly, I want to talk about taking care of yourself. It's really important to take care of yourself if you're doing this work and advocating for change. It's okay to not be okay. It's okay to be an ally to others and promote body positive culture, even if you're personally still struggling with thinking positively about your body. I found that it was really helpful to me to actually be positive to others before I felt positive towards myself. That was really helpful. Remember that anyone can be dealing with these issues, and that if you bring up the topic of body image or disordered eating, things can get serious really fast, and you might have someone disclose something. So just be prepared for that for yourself. And be conscious of the emotional labor you use in interrogating these things. It can be difficult. You can be met with a lot of resistance. People aren't aware of sizeism, and so that can be hard. So my advice is to really find buddies and allies on your campus or in your life for this work who you can talk about or who can go with you to challenge these things if you are challenging problematic language or programs. Here are resources. These are also on your handout, and I believe Charisse will send out the PowerPoint to everyone who registered. So if you want to look over those are some of my favorite resources. And my contact information as well. I have a lot more resources if you are interested. And here are a list of the references for this webinar. And yeah, that is all I have for that. I would like to open it up to questions if anyone has any.
I'll start with a question, and then please anybody type in questions to the question box. But Kate, so I work with international students, and like I'm an international student advisor, and there are certain social norms like tied to culture and body image with students from different countries that is very different than kind of what you're talking about here, and even to try to advise and or support students in adapting what body positive means for them could be really different and culturally insensitive. I mean, what are your thoughts on kind of the intersectionality between like international students growing up in a different culture and a lot of what you shared?
Yeah, I think that's really important and somewhat similar to discussions around different beauty standards in different communities, even like within the United States. Different, and it's true, a lot of different communities and places across the world have really different beauty standards, and they might be harmful in different ways, which is important to understand. So like maybe someone's, maybe someone's culture doesn't really value thinness, but they have something else that's a really dangerous beauty standard. And I think that for me, what I would say is that if you're going to talk about this subject with students who come from a really different culture and have really different ideas about the body, is to really start with them and have them talk about their experiences. Like, what are the beauty standards where you come from? What do people feel good about their bodies? Can you describe like what do people do to try to attain differences in their bodies, and really begin with an understanding of that? And from there, you can talk about what's problematic about that. You know, is it still problematic that there's a specific standard that everyone has to live up to, and does that make people feel really bad about themselves? And really get them to talk about it and question it, I would say. I think that some of the resources there's some resources on here, like on the previous slide, that are really that are more culturally inclusive. This book, The Body for Beginners, is a really kind of like quick read that just asks a lot of questions and is really broad. It asks questions like, why do we value certain things about the body? Why are we interested in this? And that could be a good like starting point to talk about that.
Thank you. So we have a second question. Can you talk about how eating disorders affect those with disabilities?
Yeah. I don't have a specific statistic on that, but I know that it is probably just as prevalent, in people with disabilities as it is with everyone else. I would guess that it's probably also underdiagnosed, just because of these biases that we all come with. And when we think about eating disorders, we do often think about, when we think about, like cisgender white women, you're right, we often think about able-bodied white women. There's also some disabilities that actually are tied to eating disorders. So they actually make it more likely that someone could develop an eating disorder, or they're often co-occurring. ADHD actually has been shown to have some ties to eating disorders, as well as I believe Asperger's or autism spectrum disorder also does. But I think something that often goes missed with both disabilities and also illness, if someone maybe has a chronic illness, is that people will miss eating disorders in those people because they'll assume that, like that's just how they're coping with their disability or their chronic illness, that they're only eating certain foods really specifically, or that they're not eating very much specifically because they don't feel well, or that's part of their disability. And maybe it is, but there has been a little research done on, people eating a certain way for an illness or even for religious reasons, and then it's sliding into an eating disorder. So I would actually be very, very, very careful, and I would be worried that those with a disability might actually be more prone, depending on the disability.
Thanks. I have one more question, Kate. So you talked a little bit about how, the school that gave students fitness trackers and how it could lead to compulsive exercising and was not necessarily the most effective means to create, body positive culture. But how would you, knowing that college is a time where we set a lot of the habits that affect us through the rest of our lives, how would you create a sort of, system or something where you're actually encouraging some activity for students that might actually be on another side of, body image, where they actually could, their doctors would tell them that they would benefit if they're focusing more on their health and fitness. And so trying to find that balance, what kind of thoughts do you have about, a means of creating kind of a, body positive culture for students specifically that maybe may identify as overweight?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one really important thing for me is that any sort of exercise program or encouragement to exercise should really not be based on a number. The idea of having to exercise every single day is impossible for most people. That's a really high standard. And so I think the allowance for, if there is going to be a program that encourages students to exercise, they should be able to set their own goals. Maybe that's exercising once a week. Maybe that's exercising once every 2 weeks. Maybe that's exercising every other day. But having that be scaled to what the student wants to do and also what the student feels able to do with their body and also with other things in their life. Sometimes exercise just isn't a priority. And I would say also, there's a lot of ways that gyms and fitness centers, whether they're on campuses or not, often really exclude individuals who aren't thin. And I've also seen really intentional programming from gyms or fitness centers that encourages people of all body types to go there. And I think there's some easy ways to do that, like having advertisements where the people in your pictures are of all different sizes, or even really being really explicit and saying group exercise class is open to all sizes, all ages, and all abilities. I think provides the option for students who maybe don't feel comfortable because they don't feel like their body looks like a body of someone who is exercising, which is untrue. Everybody can exercise.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah.
So it looks like we don't have any more questions. I just want to thank you so much for sharing your research and interest with us. As Kate mentioned, I will be sharing the webinar. The webinar has been recorded, so it will be available for all forever on the internet. And I will be sending out an email to everybody who registered for the webinar later this week. Thank you so much, Kate.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.